For nearly 70 years, a woman walked the earth in Europe and later in America, insisting she was the last surviving daughter of the Russian Tsar, the girl the world believed had died in a cellar in Siberia. Courts argued over it. Newspapers obsessed over it. Even members of the real Romanov family couldn't agree on whether to believe her. It would take almost a century and a piece of preserved medical tissue to finally learn the truth. Tonight, we tell the real story behind that mystery, the short, luminous life of Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, a girl who filled a doomed palace with laughter right up until the end. In the pale gold hush of a June morning in 1901, when the light over Peterhof fell soft and unhurried across the water, a child was born who would one day be remembered simply as Anastasia, though in that first quiet hour she was only a small, warm weight in her mother's arms, unaware of names, unaware of empires, unaware of anything at all beyond the gentle rhythm of breathing and the distant hush of voices moving carefully through the halls beyond her room. She was the fourth daughter of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra, and if we linger for a moment on that fact, it is only because it tells us something tender and human about the world she entered, a world that had hoped, quietly and almost desperately, for a son, an heir to steady the vast and uncertain machinery of the Russian Empire, and had instead been given another daughter, another small girl with soft cheeks and unfocused eyes, arriving into a nursery already gently crowded with the presence of her three elder sisters. There is a story, often repeated in hushed and affectionate tones by those who wrote of the imperial family, that when the news of her birth spread through the palace, there was a brief, heavy silence, a kind of collective exhale of disappointment among the ministers and courtiers who had hoped so fervently for a boy, and yet it is worth pausing here, in this soft opening chapter of her life, to notice how quickly that disappointment dissolved into something warmer, how quickly the small, fierce personality of this fourth daughter began to fill the rooms of the palace with her particular light, because even from her earliest days, Anastasia seemed to possess an unusual, luminous energy, a restlessness of spirit that would come to define her throughout her short life, and which even now, more than a century later, seems to glow faintly through the old photographs and diary entries that survive her. To understand Anastasia, we must first understand the world into which she was born, a world of extraordinary privilege, wrapped, almost paradoxically, in extraordinary simplicity. For although her family stood at the very pinnacle of one of the largest empires on earth, their private life, especially within the walls of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, was surprisingly modest, structured, and quiet, governed by routines that would have seemed almost monastic to an outside observer, expecting the glittering excess so often associated with royal life. The Alexander Palace itself was not the vast, ornate structure that outsiders might imagine when they think of Russian imperial architecture. Rather, it was a place of soft lamplight and pastel-colored rooms, of long corridors smelling faintly of beeswax polish and fresh flowers brought in from the greenhouses, of quiet libraries and small, intimate sitting rooms where the family gathered in the evenings, away from the formal grandeur that existed mostly for ceremonial occasions and official visitors. It was here, in these gentle, private spaces, that Anastasia spent her earliest years, cradled within a family that, whatever its immense public responsibilities, seemed to genuinely delight in the ordinary pleasures of domestic life. Reading aloud together in the evenings, taking long walks through the palace gardens, sharing simple meals, and observing the quiet, steady rhythms of the Orthodox calendar with its feast days and fasting seasons, its incense-filled chapels and softly murmured prayers. Nicholas and Alexandra, whatever judgments history would later cast upon their political decisions, were, by most accounts, deeply devoted parents, and their love for their children was neither distant nor performative, but warm, physical, and constant. Alexandra, in particular, doted on her daughters with an almost anxious tenderness, born partly from her own complicated health, and partly from the immense psychological weight she carried after the birth of her son Alexei, whose hemophilia, though carefully hidden from the public, cast a long and quiet shadow over the family's private world. But in these earliest years, before the weight of that secret fully settled upon the household, the atmosphere around Anastasia was one of warmth, laughter, and gentle indulgence, for she was, even as an infant, remarkably good-natured, prone to sudden fits of giggling, quick to reach for her sister's hands, and utterly unafraid of the many adults who moved through her world, whether they were solemn court officials, elegant foreign visitors, or the quiet, devoted servants who tended to the family's daily needs. As she grew from infancy into early childhood, Anastasia's personality began to reveal itself with increasing clarity. And it is here that we begin to see the child who would later be remembered by everyone who knew her as the family's clown, its comedian, its endless source of mischief and light. She was, by nearly every account, an extraordinarily lively and irreverent child, given to mimicking the mannerisms of the palace staff with uncanny accuracy, to climbing trees in the palace gardens, despite the disapproving looks of her governesses, and to inventing small, harmless pranks that she would carry out with an expression of theatrical innocence, as though daring anyone to suspect her involvement. Her tutors and household staff often remarked, with a mixture of exasperation and genuine affection, that Anastasia was somewhat willful, quick to argue when she felt an instruction was unfair, and entirely unbothered by the formalities that governed so much of imperial life. She was known to make faces during formal portrait sittings, to whisper jokes to her sisters during solemn court occasions, and to greet visiting dignitaries with an impish curiosity rather than the practiced reserve expected of a Grand Duchess. And yet, despite this mischievous streak, or perhaps precisely because of it, she was beloved by everyone around her, for there was nothing cruel in her humor, only a kind of irrepressible joy, a refusal to take the weight of her position too seriously, even as that position grew heavier with each passing year. Central to Anastasia's early life was the deep, almost sacred bond she shared with her three elder sisters, Olga, Tatiana, and Maria, a bond so close that the four girls were often referred to collectively by the acronym OTMA, formed from the first letters of their names, a private joke and a public shorthand that reflected just how inseparable they truly were. The sisters shared bedrooms, often two to a room, slept in simple iron beds without the luxury one might expect of princesses, and wore matching or nearly matching dresses sewn by the same seamstresses, their wardrobes deliberately understated, in keeping with Alexandra's belief that her daughters should be raised with humility despite their exalted birth. Anastasia was particularly close to Maria, the sister nearest her in age, and together the two younger girls were sometimes called the little pair, in gentle contrast to the elder pair formed by Olga and Tatiana, who were considered more serious, more studious, and somewhat more reserved in temperament. Anastasia and Maria, by contrast, were known for their playful antics, their shared love of games and simple physical mischief, and their tendency to giggle together during lessons, much to the quiet despair of their tutors. It is worth pausing here to imagine, in soft and unhurried detail, what a typical day might have looked like for young Anastasia during these tranquil years before the world outside began to press so heavily against the palace walls. Mornings would begin early, with the soft light of dawn filtering through tall windows onto simple, neatly made beds, followed by a modest breakfast taken together as a family, often consisting of little more than porridge, bread, and tea, for despite their wealth, the family prided itself on a diet and lifestyle that avoided excess. Lessons would follow, conducted by a rotating cast of tutors who taught the sisters languages, history, music, and religious instruction, though it was often noted that Anastasia, unlike her more studious sisters, found these lessons somewhat tedious, preferring instead the freedom of outdoor play, the joy of running along garden paths, or the quiet satisfaction of sketching in the margins of her notebooks rather than focusing on her studies. Afternoons might be spent walking through the palace grounds, weather permitting, along paths lined with birch trees and carefully tended flower beds, the sisters often accompanied by their mother or by trusted attendants, pausing occasionally to feed the swans that glided serenely across the palace ponds, or to gather small bouquets of wildflowers that Anastasia would present, with great ceremony, to whichever family member happened to be nearby. Evenings, perhaps the most cherished part of the family's daily rhythm, were reserved for quiet togetherness, often spent in one of the smaller, more intimate sitting rooms of the palace, where Nicholas might read aloud from a favorite novel while Alexandra worked at her embroidery, and the girls occupied themselves with quiet games, drawing, or simply resting against one another on the soft cushions of a shared sofa. The room, lit by the gentle flicker of oil lamps and the low murmur of familial conversation. It was in these evenings, more than in any formal court occasion, that the true character of the family revealed itself. For beneath the weight of their titles and the immense responsibilities that came with their birth, they were, in these private hours, simply a family, bound together by affection, routine, and a quiet, unspoken understanding that their happiest moments were the ones spent away from the public eye, hidden gently within the soft interior world of the Alexander Palace. Photography, too, played an important role in the family's private life, and it is largely because of this that we possess today such a rich and intimate visual record of Anastasia's childhood. For Nicholas and his daughters were enthusiastic amateur photographers, often carrying small cameras with them on their walks and outings, capturing candid, unguarded moments that stand in striking contrast to the formal, stiffly posed portraits typically associated with royal families of that era. In these photographs, we see Anastasia not as a distant historical figure, but as a living, breathing child, caught mid-laugh, squinting against the sunlight, arms slung casually around the shoulders of her sisters, her expression almost always playful, mischievous, and utterly present in the moment. These images, preserved now in archives and museum collections, offer us a rare and tender window into a childhood that, for all its imperial trappings, was in many ways strikingly ordinary, filled with the same small joys and simple pleasures that might have belonged to any beloved child of that era. The palace grounds themselves seemed almost designed to nurture this sense of gentle, unhurried childhood, for beyond the immediate gardens lay wider parklands, dotted with small lakes, wooded paths, and quiet clearings where the family would sometimes picnic during the warmer months, spreading blankets beneath the shade of tall trees while attendants prepared simple meals nearby. Anastasia, even as a very young child, showed a particular fondness for animals, and the family kept a number of beloved pets throughout her childhood, including dogs who followed the children everywhere they went, and it was not uncommon to find Anastasia curled up on the grass with one of these dogs resting its head in her lap, both of them dozing lazily in the warm afternoon sun, while her sisters read nearby or practiced their needlework in companionable silence. Religious observance, too, formed a deep and steady undercurrent to the family's daily life, and Anastasia grew up surrounded by the rhythms of the Orthodox liturgical calendar, attending church services with her family, observing fasting periods and absorbing, gradually and almost unconsciously, a quiet but genuine spirituality that would remain with her throughout her life. The scent of incense, the soft glow of candlelight against gilded icons, the low, resonant chanting of priests during long services, these became familiar and comforting sensory textures woven into the fabric of her childhood, providing a sense of continuity and reassurance that would, in later and far darker years, offer her family a source of quiet strength. As Anastasia moved further into childhood, her relationship with her father, Nicholas, deepened in particularly tender ways, for despite the immense burdens of his role as Tsar, he made a point of spending as much time as possible with his children, often joining them for walks, games, and simple outdoor activities whenever his official duties allowed. Nicholas was known to enjoy physical exercise and outdoor pursuits, and he frequently included his daughters in these activities, teaching them to row small boats across the palace ponds, encouraging them to explore the grounds freely, and occasionally joining in their games with a warmth and playfulness that surprised those accustomed to seeing him only in his formal ceremonial role as ruler of the empire. Anastasia, in particular, seemed to delight in these moments with her father, often seeking him out specifically to share some new joke or observation, and Nicholas, by most accounts, indulged her with visible affection, sometimes laughing openly at her antics in a way he rarely permitted himself in more public settings. Her relationship with her mother, though perhaps more complicated, given Alexandra's anxious temperament and the immense psychological burden she carried regarding her son's fragile health, was nonetheless marked by deep affection and closeness. Alexandra, despite her reputation among courtiers as reserved, even cold, was by all accounts an intensely devoted mother within the privacy of her own household, prone to spending long hours with her children, personally overseeing their education and religious instruction, and taking a hands-on approach to their upbringing that was somewhat unusual for a woman of her rank, who might easily have delegated such responsibilities entirely to governesses and tutors. Anastasia, with her irreverent humor and boundless energy, sometimes tested her mother's patience, yet even Alexandra's occasional exasperation was tempered by unmistakable fondness, and letters from this period reveal a mother who worried over her youngest daughter's health and happiness with the same intensity she devoted to her son. It was also during these early years that the shadow of Alexei's illness began to settle more firmly over the household, though its full weight would not become apparent to Anastasia herself until she was somewhat older. Hemophilia, an incurable and often fatal blood. Disorder in that era meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening for the young heir, and the family's private world grew gradually more inward-turning, more protective, more insulated from outside society, as they sought to shield Alexei, and, by extension themselves, from public scrutiny and the political vulnerabilities that his illness represented. This growing insularity would shape much of Anastasia's later childhood and adolescence, drawing the family ever closer together in their private world, even as it distanced them, sometimes to their detriment, from the wider Russian society they were meant to represent and govern. Yet in these earliest years, before political unrest and family anxieties fully asserted themselves, Anastasia's childhood remained, for the most part, a golden and protected one, filled with simple pleasures and gentle routines. She grew accustomed to the soft rustle of her sisters' dresses as they moved together through the palace corridors, to the comforting predictability of shared meals and lessons, to the quiet, steady presence of her parents nearby, and to the particular joy of small mischiefs shared conspiratorially with Maria, beneath the watchful but affectionate eyes of their governesses. It was a childhood suspended gently in time, insulated by privilege, yet grounded in simplicity, warmed by genuine familial affection, yet shadowed faintly, even then, by the quiet uncertainties that would eventually gather around her family's future. And so we leave Anastasia here, in this soft and golden period of her earliest years, a small, mischievous girl, running barefoot across sunlit lawns, laughing freely among her sisters, utterly unaware of the vast historical forces already beginning to stir in the world beyond her palace gardens. For now, let us simply rest in this gentle image, a child at play, safe within the warm embrace of her family, her laughter echoing softly through halls that, for a little while longer, remained untouched by the weight of history. As Anastasia grew beyond the softest years of early childhood into the more defined rhythms of girlhood, the world within the Alexander Palace began to reveal itself with greater clarity, not as a single golden blur of laughter and sunlight, but as a structured, deliberate universe of routine, discipline, and quiet emotional complexity, shaped above all by the private anxieties her parents carried just beneath the surface of their otherwise composed lives. To understand this period of her life, we must look closely at the peculiar architecture of the family's daily existence, for despite standing at the summit of Russian society, the Romanov children were raised with a modesty that would have surprised many who imagined their lives to be filled with unending luxury. Anastasia and her sisters slept in simple rooms, often sharing quarters, two to a chamber, their beds narrow and unadorned, their linens plain, their personal possessions kept deliberately few, for Alexandra believed firmly that her daughters should be raised with humility and self-discipline, regardless of the grandeur that surrounded them in their public role. Each morning within the palace began in near silence, the pale early light filtering through tall curtained windows, the corridors still hushed with the last traces of night before the household slowly stirred to life. A cold bath awaited each of the girls upon waking, a practice Alexandra insisted upon as a means of building resilience and hardiness in her children, believing that comfort too easily given bred weakness of character. Anastasia, by her sister's later recollections, grumbled more than the others about this particular ritual, exaggerating her shivers dramatically for the benefit of Maria, who could always be relied upon to laugh. Helplessly at these small morning performances, the two girls dissolving into muffled giggles before a stern glance from their nurse restored a semblance of order. It is a small detail, perhaps, but one that tells us much about the spirit Anastasia carried even into the most mundane corners of her day, an unwillingness to let even discomfort pass without finding within it some seed of humor. Breakfast followed in a small sunlit dining room. The family gathered together over simple fare, porridge, bread, tea poured from a heavy silver pot that had been in use for as long as any of the children could remember. It was here, over these quiet morning meals, that the day's rhythm was set, Nicholas often reading briefly from the newspaper, before turning his full attention to his children, asking after their lessons, their small concerns, their plans for the hours ahead. These mornings, unhurried and affectionate, formed the quiet backbone of the family's private life, a ritual of togetherness that persisted with remarkable consistency throughout Anastasia's childhood, regardless of the pressures that increasingly weighed upon her parents. It was during these years that the emotional undercurrents running beneath the family's polished surface became more visible to those closest to them, particularly the quiet, ever-present worry surrounding Alexei's health. Hemophilia, though carefully concealed from the Russian public, cast a long shadow over the household, and Alexandra's anxious devotion to her son shaped much of the family's private atmosphere, lending a certain fragile tenderness to even their happiest moments. Anastasia, as she grew older, became increasingly aware of this hidden vulnerability, watching as her mother's face sometimes tightened with worry over a bruise that seemed to an outsider entirely unremarkable, or as her brother was carried gently by a manservant after some minor fall that would have meant nothing to any other child, but which, for Alexei, carried the possibility of days of agonizing pain. Anastasia developed, in response to this quiet family vulnerability, a protective closeness toward her younger brother, often seeking him out for games and light-hearted mischief, as if instinctively sensing that laughter might offer him some small relief from the confinement his illness so often imposed upon him. She learned, along with her sisters, to adjust her games accordingly, softening her usual boisterousness into gentler forms of play whenever her brother's condition required it, inventing quiet amusements that could be enjoyed from the edge of a bed or the corner of a sunlit room, though she never lost her ability to make him laugh, often through exaggerated impressions of household staff or invented characters performed with theatrical flourish in the quiet privacy of the nursery. It is recorded that she once spent an entire afternoon inventing an elaborate voice and personality for one of the palace cats, narrating its supposed adventures and opinions to Alexei with such conviction that even the attending nurse found herself smiling, despite the solemnity of the sick room. This deep, watchful love for her brother existed alongside an equally deep, though differently textured, closeness with her sisters, and it was within this quartet of girls, so often referred to collectively as OTMAA, that Anastasia's emotional world found its truest anchor. Olga, the eldest, was known for her intelligence and occasional melancholy, prone to quiet introspection, and a certain seriousness that set her apart from her younger sisters, often retreating into books or music when the weight of her position pressed too heavily upon her. Tatiana, often regarded as the most organized and capable of the four, possessed a natural authority that led household staff to sometimes defer to her, even over her mother, taking charge of practical arrangements with an efficiency that belied her youth. And it was Tatiana who often mediated small disputes among her sisters, her calm judgment respected even by Anastasia in her more rebellious moods. Maria, gentle and warm-hearted, shared with Anastasia not only physical proximity in age, but also a playful spirit, and together they formed what the family affectionately called the little pair, their bond so close that they were rarely seen apart, sharing secrets, games, and a private language of jokes that often left the adults around them smiling in bemused affection. The two girls were known to sign letters jointly, sometimes even finishing each other's sentences, and their shared bedroom became a small sanctuary of whispered conversation long after they were meant to be asleep, the soft murmur of their voices drifting through the quiet palace corridors, like the gentle hum of some private, ongoing conversation that never truly ended. Anastasia, within this sisterly quartet, occupied a particular role, that of jester and provocateur, the one who could always be relied upon to break a solemn mood with an unexpected joke, to mimic a visiting dignitary's pompous manner the moment he left the room, or to organize an impromptu game of hide-and-seek through the palace's many corridors, much to the despair of governesses attempting to maintain order. She possessed an uncanny memory for the particular mannerisms of the adults around her, the way a certain minister cleared his throat before speaking, the exaggerated bow of a foreign visitor, the precise cadence of a tutor's most tedious lecture, and she would recreate these small performances for her sisters with such precision that even Olga, usually the most restrained of the four, could not always suppress her laughter. The palace itself, though grand by any ordinary standard, became for these girls simply the backdrop of ordinary childhood, its long galleries and gilded rooms transformed in their imaginations into playgrounds and hiding spots, its formal gardens into landscapes for elaborate, half-invented games that shifted daily according to Anastasia's endless creativity. She was known to organize elaborate theatrical productions, casting her siblings and sometimes even household staff into invented roles, directing these performances with a seriousness that belied the simplicity of their settings, often using little more than borrowed shawls and paper crowns to transform an ordinary afternoon into a grand, dramatic occasion. These performances, staged sometimes for an audience of nothing more than a patient nursemaid or an amused parent passing through, reveal something essential about Anastasia's character, her instinct to create joy and spectacle out of the most modest materials, her refusal to allow even the constraints of court formality to dampen her imaginative spirit. One particularly cherished memory, recorded by a family attendant, describes an entire afternoon devoted to staging what Anastasia grandly called a royal wedding between two of the family's dogs, complete with a flower arch made from garden clippings, a solemn procession down the palace steps, and an entirely improvised ceremony conducted by Anastasia herself in a mockingly serious tone, much to the delight of her sisters and the quiet amusement of the household staff who had gathered, ostensibly to attend to other duties, but in truth simply to watch the spectacle unfold. It is through such small, vivid anecdotes that we come to know Anastasia not merely as a historical figure, but as a living, breathing girl, her laughter echoing faintly still through the careful records left behind by those who loved her. Education, too, occupied a significant portion of the sisters' daily lives, structured around lessons in languages, particularly English, French, and German, alongside instruction in history, religious studies, music, and needlework, subjects considered essential for young women of their rank. Anastasia, however, found many of these lessons tedious, her restless energy ill-suited to the quiet discipline required for sustained study, and her tutors often remarked with a mixture of exasperation and fondness on her tendency to daydream during lessons, to doodle in the margins of her notebooks, or to distract her sisters with whispered jokes when she judged a lesson to be particularly dull. Her English tutor once noted, with evident affection despite his frustration, that Anastasia possessed a quick and capable mind, entirely undermined by an unwillingness to sit still long enough to apply it, though he conceded that her natural facility for mimicry meant she often absorbed the correct pronunciation and rhythm of a new language simply by playfully imitating him, even while appearing, by every outward sign, to be paying no attention whatsoever. Music filled much of the family's private life as well, and the girls were each expected to develop some proficiency on the piano, though their individual talents varied considerably. Anastasia, though not considered the most naturally gifted musician among her sisters, nonetheless enjoyed singing, often joining in enthusiastically during family musical evenings, her voice perhaps less polished than Tatiana's, but delivered with such evident enjoyment that few among her family seemed to mind. These musical evenings, held in the softly lit sitting rooms of the palace, became cherished rituals, the family gathering together after dinner to sing familiar songs, to listen to Nicholas read aloud from a favorite novel, or simply to sit together in companionable silence. The girls occupied with needlework while their parents exchanged quiet conversation nearby, the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth providing a gentle undertone to these unhurried hours. It was also during this period that the family's spiritual life deepened, particularly through their continued devotion to the Orthodox Church and their complicated, deeply personal relationship with the figure who would later become one of the most controversial presences in Russian history, Grigory Rasputin. For Alexandra, desperate for any source of hope regarding her son's illness, Rasputin's presence offered a profound, if ultimately troubled, comfort, for he seemed to possess an unusual calming influence over Alexei during his most painful episodes, and Alexandra came to regard him as something between a spiritual guide and a miraculous healer. Anastasia, still young during much of this period, experienced Rasputin's presence in the household with the uncomplicated trust of a child who saw only that this unusual bearded man brought her mother comfort and seemed to ease her brother's suffering, and she, along with her sisters, exchanged occasional letters with him, addressing him with the same simple affection they might extend to any trusted family friend, signing her notes with small, cheerful flourishes, and asking after his well-being in the plain, direct language of a child, unaware of the controversies swirling around this figure in wider society. Religious observance, more broadly, continued to shape the family's rhythms throughout this period, and Anastasia grew increasingly familiar with the long, incense-filled services of the Orthodox liturgical calendar, the solemn beauty of Easter celebrations, the quiet observance of Lenten fasting, and the comforting repetition of daily prayers recited within the palace's private chapel. These rituals provided a steady undercurrent of continuity and reassurance, weaving spirituality seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life, so that faith became for Anastasia not a separate, formal practice, but simply another gentle rhythm woven into the ordinary texture of her days, as familiar and comforting as the soft chime of palace clocks marking the hours. She particularly loved the midnight Easter service, the darkened church slowly filling with candlelight as the priest announced the resurrection, the congregation's voices rising together in joyful response. And she would later describe, in letters to friends, the particular beauty of that moment when the whole chapel seemed to glow softly gold against the surrounding darkness. Beyond the palace walls, the family maintained several other residences that played important roles in shaping Anastasia's childhood memories, particularly their beloved retreat at Livadia in the Crimea, where the Black Sea's warm air and dramatic coastal scenery offered a welcome contrast to the more formal atmosphere of Tsarskoye Selo. Summers spent at Livadia allowed the family a rare, precious sense of relaxation, and Anastasia treasured these interludes, delighting in swimming, picnicking along the shoreline, and exploring the palace's extensive gardens, which offered new landscapes for her endless imaginative games. Photographs from this period capture the sisters barefoot on sun-warmed rocks, laughing together in simple cotton dresses, their formal court identities momentarily set aside in favor of ordinary childhood pleasures, their skin browned by the sun, their hair loosened from its usual careful arrangement, their laughter carrying freely across the warm sea air in a way that would have seemed almost unthinkable within the more formal confines of Tsarskoye Selo. Equally significant were the family's annual cruises aboard their imperial yacht, the Standard, journeys through the calm waters of the Finnish fjords that provided some of the happiest memories of Anastasia's childhood. Aboard the Standard, the strict formalities of court life relaxed considerably, and the children were permitted greater freedom to play, explore, and interact informally with the ship's crew, many of whom grew genuinely fond of the lively, mischievous youngest daughter, who delighted in learning small tasks from the sailors, and often invented games involving elaborate imaginary voyages to distant invented lands. These cruises offered Anastasia and her siblings rare opportunities for unstructured play away from the watchful formality of palace life, and she cherished these interludes deeply, treasuring the simple pleasures of salt air, gentle waves, and the easy camaraderie she found among the ship's crew, some of whom taught her simple knots and small sailing terms that she repeated proudly to her family at dinner, delighted by this small acquisition of practical knowledge so different from her usual lessons. Yet, even amid these gentle pleasures, subtle signs of the family's growing isolation from wider Russian society began to emerge. For Alexandra's protective instincts, intensified by Alexei's illness, and her own increasing susceptibility to anxiety and ill health, led the family to withdraw more consistently into their private world, limiting their public appearances and reducing their engagement with the broader aristocratic society that had once surrounded previous generations of the imperial family. This growing insularity, though rooted in genuine parental concern, would later contribute to a sense of distance between the monarchy and the Russian public. Yet, within the immediate, sheltered world of Anastasia's childhood, it simply meant a deepening closeness among the immediate family members themselves, a tightening of familial bonds that, while limiting in some respects, also produced an unusually intimate, affectionate household atmosphere rarely seen among royal families of that era. Within this increasingly private world, Anastasia's relationships with her parents continued to deepen in their own particular ways. Nicholas, though burdened increasingly by the political pressures of his role, remained a warm, engaged father, often setting aside time each day specifically to spend with his children, whether through shared walks, games, or quiet conversation. And Anastasia in particular delighted in these moments, often seeking her father out specifically to share some new joke or observation she had gathered during her day. He was known to keep a small notebook of amusing remarks made by his children, and several entries attributed to Anastasia reveal a child whose humor was already sharp, observant, and entirely her own, delivered with the confident timing of someone who understood instinctively how to make an adult laugh. Alexandra, despite her anxieties, remained deeply involved in her daughter's upbringing, personally overseeing much of their education and religious instruction, and, though her relationship with Anastasia was occasionally strained by the girl's more rebellious, high-spirited nature, letters from this period reveal a mother who worried tenderly over her youngest daughter's happiness and well-being, often expressing gentle exasperation mixed with clear affection regarding Anastasia's antics. In one such letter, Alexandra describes Anastasia as incorrigible but impossible to be angry with for long, a phrase that captures with particular tenderness the peculiar charm that allowed Anastasia to disrupt even the most solemn household routines without ever truly losing the affection of those around her. As Anastasia moved further into adolescence, subtle changes began to emerge in her personality, though her fundamental warmth and humor remained constant. She grew slightly more self-aware, more conscious of her position and its responsibilities, yet she never entirely relinquished the playful mischievousness that had defined her since earliest childhood. Household staff and family friends continued to remark upon her sharp wit, her talent for mimicry, and her seemingly endless store of energy, even as she began to take on slightly more mature responsibilities, accompanying her mother and elder sisters on occasional charitable visits, and beginning to develop a more nuanced understanding of the world beyond the palace walls. It was during these years, too, that the sisters' individual identities became more clearly defined within the family's private mythology, each daughter possessing her own particular reputation, her own small collection of endearing quirks and characteristics affectionately catalogued within family letters and diaries. Anastasia's reputation as the family's comedian solidified further, her nickname among close family friends becoming something akin to the imp or the little one full of mischief, and she embraced this identity with evident pleasure, seemingly delighting in the role she had carved out for herself within her family's private emotional landscape. As we draw this chapter gently toward its close, let us pause once more within this warm, softly lit world of familial intimacy, this private universe of ritual, laughter, and quiet devotion that Anastasia inhabited throughout these tender years of her girlhood. Let us imagine her once more within the soft glow of a palace evening, curled comfortably beside Maria on a cushioned sofa, her sisters nearby, her parents engaged in quiet conversation across the room, the soft murmur of family voices blending gently with the distant, steady ticking of a palace clock, the faint scent of beeswax candles drifting through the room, the fire settling slowly into embers as the hour grows late. It is an image worth holding on to, gentle and golden, as we prepare to move forward into the years when the wider world would begin, slowly and inevitably, to press against the walls of this sheltered, loving household. By the summer of 1914, Anastasia had grown into a bright, spirited girl of 13, still carrying within her all the warmth and mischief that had defined her earliest years, yet beginning now to notice, with the quiet perceptiveness that often accompanies the edge of adolescence, that the world beyond the palace gardens was shifting in ways she could not fully name. It is in this chapter that we allow the story to widen gently outward, moving beyond the intimate, softly lit rooms of the Alexander Palace to include the larger currents of history that were beginning, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to press against the edges of her family's private world. And yet, even here, even as we speak of war and unrest, we do so with the same unhurried, reflective tone that has carried us thus far, for this is not a story of sudden shocks or dramatic upheavals, but rather one of gradual, quiet transformation, felt first in small changes of atmosphere before it ever announced itself in grand or terrible ways. The last days of that particular summer, before the news of war arrived, remain preserved in memory as some of the softest and most golden of Anastasia's adolescence. The family had been at their seaside retreat, the warm Crimean air settling over them in slow, unhurried afternoons, the girls spending long hours by the water, their laughter carrying easily across the quiet coastline. It is worth pausing here, before we turn to the heavier matters that follow, to imagine Anastasia, in these final untroubled weeks, her skin warmed by the sun, her hair loosened from its usual careful arrangement, running along the shore with Maria while her elder sisters read quietly nearby beneath the shade of a striped awning. These were, though no one could have known it then, among the last entirely carefree days the family would ever share together. And there is something quietly moving in imagining them now, suspended in that golden, unknowing calm, just before the wider world reached in and touched their lives. The outbreak of the First World War that August arrived not as a single dramatic event within the walls of the palace, but as a slow deepening of solemnity that settled over the household in the weeks and months that followed. Anastasia, like her sisters, would have noticed first the changed expressions on the faces of the adults around her, the hushed urgency of conversations conducted just out of earshot, the sudden increase in visitors arriving at odd hours, their faces drawn with concern. She would have noticed, too, the newspapers left open on tables where they had not been before, the maps unrolled across her father's desk, the unfamiliar weight settling into her parents' voices even during the most ordinary exchanges. Nicholas, ever devoted to his sense of duty, found himself drawn increasingly away from the quiet domestic rhythms of family life and toward the heavier responsibilities of a nation now committed to war, and though he remained, whenever possible, a loving and attentive father, his absences grew more frequent, his return visits shorter, his manner, even in these tender family moments, tinged with a new gravity that had not been present in earlier years. Alexandra, too, transformed under the pressure of these new circumstances, channeling her considerable nervous energy into practical work rather than allowing herself to be consumed entirely by anxiety. She threw herself into the organization of hospitals and nursing efforts, training alongside her two eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, as Red Cross nurses, learning to dress wounds, assist in surgeries, and offer what comfort they could to the steady stream of injured soldiers arriving from the front. It is recorded that Alexandra herself assisted in operations, holding instruments, steadying frightened young men as surgeons worked, an image that stands in striking contrast to the popular image of the Empress as a distant, aloof figure, and one that reveals instead a woman determined to meet the crisis facing her country with direct, practical service, rather than retreat into ceremonial distance. Anastasia, still considered too young for such formal nursing duties, nonetheless found her own quiet ways to contribute, accompanying her mother and sisters on visits to the hospital wards that had been established within the palace grounds, where she would sit beside wounded soldiers, some barely older than boys themselves, offering conversation, small gifts, and the simple, invaluable comfort of her cheerful presence. It is said that she possessed a particular gift for lifting the spirits of these injured men, her natural humor and warmth cutting gently through the pain and fear that so often filled those hospital rooms, and soldiers who encountered her during these visits later recalled with evident fondness the young Grand Duchess who had sat beside their beds, asking about their families, sharing small jokes, and treating them not as strangers, but as though they were already old friends. One soldier's account, preserved in later memoirs, describes Anastasia teaching him a simple card trick to pass the long, painful hours of his recovery, returning day after day to check on his progress with the trick, delighted each time he managed to perform it correctly, as though this small, ordinary triumph mattered as much to her as it did to him. These hospital visits mark an important turning point in Anastasia's development, for it was here, amid the quiet suffering of wounded soldiers, that she first began to encounter the wider world beyond her sheltered palace existence, not through political discussion or formal education, but through direct, personal contact with ordinary people whose lives had been touched by forces far greater than themselves. She wrote letters to some of these soldiers after their recovery, maintaining correspondence with men she had met only briefly during their hospital stay, and these letters, filled with her characteristic warmth and curiosity, reveal a girl beginning to develop a genuine, if still somewhat innocent awareness of the wider suffering that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of her privileged upbringing. She asked after their families, their villages, their lives before the war, absorbing through these small correspondences a broader, more textured understanding of the vast country over which her father ruled. An understanding built not from maps or lessons, but from the direct human testimony of soldiers who had seen the war firsthand. Even as she continued these small acts of wartime service, the deeper rhythms of Anastasia's daily life remained, for a time, remarkably unchanged, anchored still in the familiar routines of lessons, family meals, and quiet evenings spent together within the palace's private rooms. The family continued to observe the Orthodox religious calendar with the same devotion as before, finding perhaps even greater comfort now in these rituals of continuity and faith. As the wider world grew increasingly uncertain, the candlelit services offering a stillness that stood in gentle contrast to the growing turbulence beyond the palace walls. Yet, subtle changes had begun to creep into even these familiar rhythms, for the conversations overheard at the edges of family gatherings grew more frequently concerned with matters of state, casualty figures, and the shifting fortunes of the war, and Anastasia, though still shielded from the full weight of these concerns, could not help but absorb something of the gathering unease that had begun to settle over her parents. It was during this period, too, that Nicholas made the fateful decision to assume personal command of the Russian armed forces, a decision that required him to spend increasingly long periods away from his family at military headquarters, further deepening the household's sense of quiet loneliness, even as it drew the remaining family members closer together in his absence. Letters exchanged between Nicholas and his children during these separations reveal a tenderness undimmed by distance. Nicholas asking after each child individually, inquiring about their lessons, their health, their small daily concerns, and Anastasia's replies in turn carry a note of genuine longing beneath their characteristic cheerfulness, small requests for him to return soon, playful accounts of household happenings intended to make him smile even from hundreds of miles away. Alexandra, left largely to manage both the household and increasingly complex political pressures on her own, leaned more heavily than ever on her daughters for companionship and support. And it was in this context that Anastasia's role within the family subtly shifted, her natural cheerfulness becoming not merely a source of amusement, but an important emotional anchor for a mother increasingly burdened by worry and isolation. Attendants recalled Anastasia making a particular point of sitting with her mother during the quiet evening hours, when Alexandra's anxiety seemed most acute, offering small distractions, gentle jokes, or simply a comforting, familiar presence that required no words at all. The whispers surrounding Rasputin, too, grew louder and more troubling during this period, though we continue here, as before, to view him through the softer, more private lens of the family's own experience, rather than through the lens of the political scandal that swirled increasingly around his name in wider Russian society. To Anastasia, he likely remained simply the strange, familiar figure who brought her mother comfort and who seemed in his own enigmatic way devoted to the well-being of her fragile younger brother, even as rumors and accusations against him multiplied in the capital, feeding a growing public resentment toward the imperial family that Anastasia, still protected within her sheltered world, could not yet fully comprehend. She continued to write him small, affectionate notes during this period, unaware of the darker political currents his presence had come to represent for so many outside her family's private circle. Despite these gathering shadows, Anastasia's essential character remained remarkably resilient throughout this period, her humor and warmth continuing to shine through, even as the broader atmosphere around her grew heavier with uncertainty. She continued to find joy in small things: a favorite dog curled beside her during a quiet afternoon, a shared joke with Maria during an otherwise solemn family dinner, the simple pleasure of a walk through the palace gardens on a mild autumn afternoon, the leaves turning gold and drifting slowly to the ground around her. These small, ordinary pleasures took on a particular poignancy in retrospect, for they represented perhaps the last extended period of relative normalcy that Anastasia and her family would ever know, though, of course, neither she nor anyone else around her could have understood this at the time. Her diary entries from these years, preserved carefully by historians, reveal a young woman gradually growing more thoughtful and observant, even as she retained much of her earlier playfulness and wit. She wrote of her hospital visits with evident pride and satisfaction, describing particular soldiers she had grown fond of, recounting small stories they had shared with her, and expressing, in her own simple and direct way, a genuine desire to be useful during this difficult time for her country. She wrote, too, of missing her father during his long absences at military headquarters, expressing in tender, uncomplicated language the ordinary longing of a daughter for her parent, untouched by any political sophistication, yet deeply moving in its simplicity and honesty. One entry describes counting the days until his promised return, marking each one carefully in the margin of her notebook, a small, quiet ritual of hope that speaks volumes about the emotional world of a girl trying to hold her family together through sheer force of affection. As the war dragged on through 1915 and into 1916, the atmosphere within the palace grew increasingly strained, the visits from wounded soldiers more frequent and more severe, the conversations among the adults more anxious and hushed. Yet the family continued as much as possible to maintain their private rituals of togetherness, finding in these familiar routines a source of stability amid the growing uncertainty of the wider world. Anastasia, now approaching her mid-teens, began to take on slightly greater responsibilities within the household, assisting her mother with correspondence, helping to organize charitable efforts on behalf of soldiers' families, and generally beginning the slow, gentle transition from childhood into the responsibilities of young womanhood, though she retained, throughout this transition, much of the playful spirit and irreverent humor that had defined her since her earliest years. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the peculiar emotional position occupied by Anastasia and her sisters during this period, caught between the innocence of childhood and the growing awareness of a world increasingly shaped by suffering and uncertainty. They remained, in many ways, sheltered and protected, their daily lives still structured around lessons, family meals, and quiet evenings together. Yet they could not entirely escape the mounting tension that surrounded their family. The whispered rumors, the anxious glances exchanged between their parents, the growing sense that the comfortable, stable world they had always known was beginning, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to shift beneath their feet. Anastasia's response to this growing uncertainty, as best as we can discern from her letters and diaries, was neither fear nor despair, but rather a kind of quiet, instinctive resilience, a determination to find joy and meaning in whatever small pleasures remained available to her, even as the broader circumstances of her family's life grew increasingly complicated and uncertain. The winters during this period brought their own particular texture to the family's life. The palace grounds blanketed in snow, the long evenings drawing the family closer together around the fire. And Anastasia, ever fond of the outdoors, continued to find joy in these colder months, organizing snowball fights with her siblings whenever the weight of the household's concerns allowed for such lightness, building small snow figures on the palace grounds with a concentration and delight that seemed in these moments entirely untouched by the anxieties pressing upon the adults around her. These winter afternoons, crisp and quiet, offered a particular kind of solace. The world outside softened and hushed beneath fresh snow, the palace windows glowing warmly against the early winter darkness. The family gathered together within, in a stillness that felt, for a few precious hours, entirely removed from the growing turbulence of the wider world. By the final months of 1916, the political situation within Russia had grown markedly more precarious, with rising public discontent, worsening military fortunes, and increasing criticism directed at the imperial family, particularly regarding their perceived closeness to Rasputin, whose assassination in December of that year sent shockwaves through the capital, though its full significance likely remained somewhat abstract to Anastasia herself, still absorbed primarily in the immediate personal world of her family, rather than the broader political currents swirling around them. Yet even she could not have remained entirely unaware of the growing tension within her household during this period. The hushed, worried conversations between her parents, the palpable sense of anxiety that had begun to permeate even the most private and protected corners of her family's world. She noted in her diary, with the plain honesty characteristic of her writing, that her mother seemed increasingly tired, increasingly burdened, and that the household staff moved through their duties with a new, careful quietness that had not been present in earlier years. As we draw this chapter gently to its close, we find Anastasia standing, quite unknowingly, at the edge of a great historical threshold, still very much a girl in most respects, still finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of family life, still capable of laughter and mischief, even amid growing uncertainty, yet also beginning, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to sense that the world she had always known was shifting beneath her, like the first distant rumble of thunder heard faintly on a still summer evening, not yet alarming, not yet fully understood, but present nonetheless. A quiet reminder that even the most sheltered and protected lives remain ultimately subject to the larger currents of history, moving steadily and inexorably around them. We leave her here, in this fragile twilight moment of relative calm before greater changes arrive, resting gently in the last soft glow of a world about to change forever, though for now, mercifully, still whole, still familiar, still filled with the comforting presence of family, gathered closely together against the gathering dark. Her laughter still echoing faintly through rooms that had not yet learned to fall silent. In March of 1917, the world that Anastasia had known since birth came to a quiet, almost dreamlike end, not through any single dramatic moment, but through a gradual unraveling that would have felt, to a girl not yet 16, more like the slow closing of a door than the sudden shattering of glass. Her father, Nicholas, faced with mounting unrest in the capital and the collapse of support among his own military commanders, made the decision to abdicate the throne ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule over Russia in a matter of days rather than years. We do not linger here on the political mechanics of this collapse, for this is not a story of empires and ministers, but of a family, and it is through the quiet, intimate lens of that family's experience that we continue our gentle telling. What mattered most to Anastasia in those early days of upheaval was not the abstract concept of a throne lost, but the immediate, tangible reality of her father returning home to them, no longer as Tsar, but simply as a husband and a father, his face marked by an exhaustion and sorrow that his children had rarely seen before. It is worth pausing here to imagine that first reunion. The family gathered together in a quiet room of the palace, the usual formalities momentarily stripped away, Nicholas embracing each of his children in turn, his composure holding steady even as something visibly heavier had settled into his bearing. Anastasia, ever attuned to the emotional undercurrents of those she loved, would have sensed immediately that something profound had shifted, though the precise nature of that shift likely remained for a time somewhat abstract to her, filtered. Through the more immediate and comprehensible language of her father's tired eyes and her mother's uncharacteristic silence. Children, even those on the cusp of adulthood, often understand the emotional weather of a household before they understand its causes, and it is in this sense that we might imagine Anastasia first grasping the enormity of what had happened, not through political explanation, but through the simple, unmistakable heaviness that had entered the rooms she had always known to be filled with warmth. The family's world contracted almost immediately. The vast, invisible machinery of empire that had once surrounded them falling away, leaving in its place a smaller, quieter, more uncertain existence within the walls of the Alexander Palace, now guarded not by ceremonial honor, but by armed soldiers loyal to the new provisional government. Anastasia and her siblings found themselves, almost overnight, transformed from Grand Duchesses and Duke into prisoners within their own childhood home, their movements restricted, their correspondence monitored, their once familiar gardens now patrolled by unfamiliar guards whose presence introduced an entirely new and unsettling texture to their daily lives. The guards themselves varied considerably in temperament, some maintaining a respectful distance, others openly hostile or curious in ways that must have felt, to a girl accustomed to the deferential courtesy of palace life, both strange and faintly humiliating, though Anastasia, by every account, met this new reality with more curiosity than fear, occasionally even attempting to charm or amuse the younger guards with her characteristic humor, much to the quiet astonishment of her more reserved sisters. And yet, even amid this profound and disorienting change, the family sought, with quiet determination, to preserve as much normalcy as possible, continuing their lessons, their meals, their evening readings together, as though by maintaining these small rituals of ordinary life, they might somehow hold at bay the larger uncertainties pressing in around them. Tutors who remained loyal to the family continued their instruction largely unchanged, and Anastasia's lessons proceeded much as before, though now conducted under the watchful, sometimes bemused attention of guards stationed nearby, their presence a constant, quiet reminder of how thoroughly the family's circumstances had shifted, even as the surface routines of daily life remained deceptively familiar. It is here that Anastasia's resilience, so evident throughout her earlier childhood, revealed itself with particular poignancy. For even as the family's circumstances grew increasingly restricted and uncertain, she continued to find small moments of humor and lightness, organizing simple games among her siblings, teasing her sisters gently to lift their spirits, and maintaining, as much as possible, the same irreverent warmth that had always defined her. Diary entries from this period, though understandably more subdued than in earlier years, still reveal flashes of her characteristic wit, small observations about the guards now stationed around the palace, gentle jokes about the strange new routines imposed upon the family, and an underlying steady affection for her parents and siblings that remained entirely undiminished by the dramatic change in their circumstances. In one entry, she describes with evident amusement a guard who had grown visibly flustered when she greeted him cheerfully by name, having apparently expected, from a member of the deposed imperial family, either haughty disdain or tearful despair, rather than simple, friendly acknowledgment. The gardens of the Alexander Palace, once a place of unrestricted play and exploration, now became one of the few remaining spaces where the family could move somewhat freely, and Anastasia and her siblings spent long hours walking along familiar paths under the watchful eyes of their guards, finding in these walks a fragile continuity with the freedoms of their earlier childhood. Nicholas, stripped now of his official duties, found himself with unaccustomed time to spend with his children, and it is recorded that he took particular pleasure during this period in gardening alongside them, teaching them to cultivate small vegetable plots, an activity that Anastasia embraced with characteristic enthusiasm, finding genuine satisfaction in the simple, tangible labor of tending growing things, a modest but meaningful contrast to the vast, abstract uncertainties now surrounding her family's future. She took particular pride in a small plot of cabbages she had claimed as her own responsibility, checking on their progress daily with the same serious attention she might once have given to a far grander undertaking. And it is not difficult to imagine the quiet satisfaction she must have felt watching something under her own care grow steadily, reliably, in a world where so much else had become uncertain. Evenings during this period retained much of their earlier warmth, the family continuing to gather together for shared readings, quiet conversation, and, occasionally, small theatrical performances that the children organized among themselves, drawing on costumes and props gathered from the palace's now somewhat depleted resources. Anastasia, ever drawn to performance and mimicry, took particular delight in these amateur theatricals, often taking on comic roles that allowed her natural talent for impressions and humor to shine even amid the family's increasingly straitened circumstances. These small performances, staged in dimly lit rooms before an audience consisting only of family members and a few trusted attendants, offered a precious source of laughter and connection during a period increasingly defined by uncertainty and restriction, and it is not difficult to imagine the particular tenderness of these evenings, the family drawing closer together precisely because the wider world had grown so much more distant and unfamiliar. Nicholas himself, in his own diary from this period, recorded with evident tenderness the small comforts of these family evenings, noting on more than one occasion how much lighter his spirits felt after watching his children's improvised performances, how Anastasia in particular seemed to possess an almost magical ability to dissolve, however briefly, the heavy uncertainty that had settled over the household. These small domestic details, preserved through the careful diary-keeping habits of the family, offer us today an intimate window into a household determined to hold on to joy and connection, even as the larger circumstances of their lives grew increasingly precarious. As the months passed, however, it became increasingly clear that the family's situation at Tsarskoye Selo remained precarious, and in August of 1917, the decision was made to relocate them further from the capital, to the remote Siberian town of Tobolsk, a journey that Anastasia and her family undertook by train and later by river steamer, traveling slowly eastward through landscapes that grew increasingly wild and unfamiliar as they left behind the elegant, cultivated world of Tsarskoye Selo. We might imagine this journey now with a soft, cinematic quality. The family gathered together in railway carriages, watching through window glass as the familiar landmarks of their previous life gradually gave way to endless birch forests, wide rivers, and the vast, quiet emptiness of the Russian countryside stretching out toward the horizon. Anastasia, ever curious and observant, likely spent much of this journey watching the passing scenery with interest, her natural resilience allowing her to find a kind of quiet wonder, even in this uncertain and unsettling passage toward an unknown future. Pointing out to her sisters the small villages glimpsed briefly through the train windows, the wide, slow rivers reflecting the pale summer sky, the endless procession of birch trees standing like quiet sentinels along the passing landscape, the river journey that followed, aboard a steamer making its way slowly along the Tura and Tobol rivers, offered its own particular texture of quiet beauty, the family spending long hours on deck watching the gradually shifting landscape, the wide Siberian sky stretching endlessly overhead, the gentle rhythm of the boat's engine providing a steady, almost soothing undertone to these final days of transition. It is recorded that the children, Anastasia included, seemed to find in this river passage a rare, unexpected peace. The vast openness of the Siberian landscape, offering a kind of psychological respite from the cramped uncertainty of their final weeks at Tsarskoye Selo, even as they traveled steadily toward a future none of them could fully anticipate. Their arrival in Tobolsk marked yet another significant contraction of the family's world, as they took up residence in the relatively modest governor's house, a building far removed in scale and grandeur from the palaces they had known throughout their earlier lives, yet one which they approached, characteristically, with quiet adaptability rather than despair. The rooms were smaller, the furnishings simpler, the daily routines more constrained, yet the family sought once again to establish familiar patterns within this new and unfamiliar setting, continuing their lessons, their religious observances, and their evening gatherings with the same quiet determination that had sustained them through the earlier upheavals of that tumultuous year. Anastasia, now 16 years old, found herself adapting with remarkable grace to these diminished circumstances, embracing small pleasures wherever she could find them, tending a modest garden established within the grounds of the governor's house, playing with the family's remaining pets, and continuing her lessons under the guidance of tutors who had chosen to accompany the family into exile out of loyalty and affection. Her letters from this period, though understandably more restrained given the increased scrutiny under which the family now lived, continued to reveal her characteristic warmth and resilience, describing small domestic details with the same attentive curiosity that had always marked her correspondence, offering glimpses of ordinary humanity, persisting quietly amid extraordinary circumstances. She wrote in one letter of the particular pleasure of watching snow begin to fall over the unfamiliar Siberian landscape, finding in this simple natural occurrence a small, comforting continuity with the winters she had known throughout her childhood, regardless of how different everything else around her had become. The relationship between Anastasia and her siblings grew, if anything, even closer during this period of enforced isolation. The 5 children, drawing upon one another for companionship and emotional support in a world that had grown increasingly narrow and uncertain. Alexei, whose fragile health remained a constant source of concern, found particular comfort in his sister's company, and Anastasia, despite her own understandable anxieties, continued to offer her younger brother the same playful affection she had always shown him, organizing small games and diversions intended to lift his spirits during difficult days. The four sisters, too, maintained their close, affectionate bond, sharing rooms, secrets, and small domestic tasks with the same easy companionship that had characterized their relationship since early childhood, finding in one another's presence a source of stability and comfort that the wider world could no longer reliably provide. The household staff, who had chosen to accompany the family into this remote exile, a small but devoted group, became an increasingly important part of the family's daily world during this period, their loyalty offering a quiet, steady reassurance amid the uncertainty of their changed circumstances. Anastasia, always warm and unpretentious in her relationships with those who served her family, maintained easy, affectionate connections with these attendants, and it is recorded that she often sought out their company for conversation, curious about their own lives and experiences, in a manner that reflected the same generous curiosity she had shown toward the wounded soldiers she had visited during the war. Religious observance remained a particularly important source of solace during this period of exile, the family continuing to attend church services whenever permitted, finding in these familiar rituals a continuity of faith that helped sustain them through the uncertainties of their changed circumstances. Anastasia, whose earlier religious instruction had instilled in her a genuine, if quietly held, spirituality, seems to have drawn increasing comfort from these observances during this period, her diary entries reflecting a growing thoughtfulness and reflection that suggests a young woman beginning, gradually and gently, to grapple with questions of faith and meaning in the face of profound uncertainty. Despite the hardships and restrictions of this period, it would be inaccurate to characterize these months in Tobolsk as a time of unrelieved gloom or despair, for the family, and Anastasia in particular, continued to find genuine moments of joy and connection even amid their diminished circumstances. Small celebrations were still observed, birthdays marked with whatever modest festivities remained available to them, and the family's evening gatherings continued to provide a source of warmth and laughter that helped sustain their spirits through the long, uncertain months of their Siberian exile. It is recorded that for one sister's birthday during this period, Anastasia organized an elaborate surprise involving handmade decorations fashioned from whatever materials could be gathered within the confines of their new home, a small but determined effort to preserve some sense of celebration and normalcy despite the vastly reduced resources available to them. The family also took particular comfort during this period in the construction of a small greenhouse, where they grew vegetables to supplement their now more modest diet, and Anastasia threw herself into this project with characteristic enthusiasm, finding, in the simple, tangible work of cultivation, a welcome distraction from the uncertainties of their broader situation. She wrote with evident pride of the first vegetables harvested from this garden, describing the taste of home-grown cucumbers with an enthusiasm that reveals, even amid such reduced circumstances, her enduring capacity for finding genuine pleasure in life's smaller accomplishments. As we draw this chapter toward its close, we find Anastasia and her family settled, however uneasily, into their new life in Tobolsk, their world now smaller and more constrained than at any previous point in their lives, yet still animated by the same deep bonds of affection and loyalty that had always defined their relationships with one another. The vast, glittering world of the Alexander Palace, with its golden light and gentle luxury, had receded now into memory, replaced by the more modest, more uncertain reality of their Siberian exile. Yet, the essential character of the family, their quiet devotion to one another, their capacity for finding small joys amid difficult circumstances, remained remarkably unchanged. We leave Anastasia here, in this quiet, reflective interlude, gathered close among her family within the modest rooms of the governor's house, the vast Siberian landscape stretching out beyond their windows, unaware still of how much further their journey into uncertainty would eventually take them, but sustained for now by the enduring warmth of family and the quiet, steady rhythms of a life determined, against all odds, to preserve some small measure of tenderness and normalcy amid the gathering shadows of history. In the spring of 1918, the family's quiet exile in Tobolsk gave way to yet another relocation, this time to the city of Yekaterinburg, deep within the Ural Mountains, where they would be housed in a modest, unassuming residence that history would come to know as the Ipatiev House. We approach this chapter with particular tenderness, for it carries within it the final months of Anastasia's life. And, though the story that unfolds here contains sorrow, we tell it in the same soft, reflective voice that has guided us throughout, treating these final months not as a descent into horror, but as a quiet, dignified closing chapter in the life of a young woman who, until the very end, remained remarkably herself, warm, resilient, and deeply devoted to the family who surrounded her. The journey to Yekaterinburg itself unfolded slowly and with a quiet sorrow of its own. The family briefly separated during the transition, Alexandra and Nicholas traveling ahead with Maria, while Anastasia remained behind in Tobolsk with her other siblings to care for Alexei, whose health had worsened too severely for immediate travel. This brief separation, the first significant parting the family had experienced since the upheavals of the previous year, weighed heavily upon them, and letters exchanged during these weeks reveal a tenderness sharpened by distance, Anastasia writing frequently to her parents with small updates on her brother's condition, her words carrying both her habitual warmth and an unmistakable undertone of worry for a family increasingly aware of how precious and fragile their remaining time together had become. When, at last, the reunion came, the family gathered once more within the walls of the Ipatiev house, the relief of their reunion offering a brief, quiet comfort amid the growing uncertainty of their circumstances. The Ipatiev house itself, unlike the palaces and governor's residences the family had known before, was a modest two-story building in the center of the city, its windows soon whitewashed and boarded to prevent any view of the outside world, its rooms far smaller and more cramped than anything the family had previously experienced. Anastasia, along with her parents and siblings, found their world reduced now to a handful of rooms, their days structured by the presence of guards whose attitudes toward the family varied from indifferent to openly hostile, a marked change from the more respectful, if still restrictive treatment they had experienced in Tobolsk. The house had been given, by those responsible for the family's confinement, the ominous designation of House of Special Purpose, though it is unlikely that Anastasia or her siblings fully grasped the sinister weight carried by this bureaucratic phrase, absorbed as they were in the immediate, practical challenges of adapting to yet another diminished and unfamiliar home. And yet, Even within these narrowed and increasingly uncertain circumstances, the family continued to draw upon the same deep wells of affection and quiet resilience that had sustained them through every previous hardship, finding in one another's presence a source of comfort that no external circumstance could fully diminish. Anastasia's diary entries from this period, though understandably brief and increasingly restrained given the closer scrutiny under which the family now lived, continue to reveal glimpses of her enduring warmth and humor, small observations about daily routines, gentle references to shared jokes with her sisters, and quiet expressions of affection for her parents and brother that speak to a spirit remarkably unbroken despite the mounting hardships surrounding her. She and her sisters continued to share small domestic tasks, mending clothing, preparing simple meals alongside the family's remaining loyal attendants, and finding, even within these confined and uncertain circumstances, small moments of connection and even occasional laughter that offered brief respite from the underlying tension of their situation. The windows of the house, painted over to prevent any glimpse of the outside world, meant that the family's days unfolded now in a strange, filtered light. The natural rhythms of morning and evening softened and obscured, and it is worth pausing here to imagine how this must have altered the small sensory textures of their daily life. The usual comfort of watching sunlight move slowly across a familiar room now replaced by a dimmer, more uniform light that blurred the natural passage of hours. Despite this, the family maintained, as best they could, the outward rhythms of their previous life, rising at accustomed hours, gathering for meals together, continuing whatever fragments of lessons and reading remained possible within their constrained circumstances. The family's daily routine within the Ipatiev house, though far more restricted than anything they had previously known, retained certain familiar rhythms that offered a measure of continuity and comfort. Mornings began with simple prayers, followed by modest meals shared together, and the days were structured around small tasks, quiet reading, and whatever limited exercise the confines of their situation permitted, often consisting of brief walks within a small enclosed courtyard under the watchful eyes of their guards. These walks, brief as they were, offered a precious daily ritual, the family moving slowly together along the same short path. Anastasia often walking alongside her father, the two of them exchanging quiet conversation, or beside Maria, the sisters maintaining, even now, their easy, affectionate companionship despite the shrinking boundaries of their world. Nicholas, ever devoted to his family, despite the reduced circumstances of their lives, continued to spend as much time as possible with his children, reading aloud in the evenings, engaging them in quiet conversation, and offering, through his continued presence and calm demeanor, a steady source of reassurance during this deeply uncertain period. He maintained, even now, a careful diary of the family's daily life, his entries revealing a man determined to preserve some sense of ordinary structure and purpose, despite the mounting uncertainty of their situation. His descriptions of small domestic details, meals shared, books read aloud, weather observed through whatever narrow gaps remained in the whitewashed windows, offering us today a quiet, intimate window into these final months. Alexandra, whose health had grown increasingly fragile throughout the years of upheaval, relied more heavily than ever on her daughters for companionship and support, and Anastasia, alongside her sisters, continued to offer her mother the same devoted care and affection that had characterized their relationship throughout her childhood. It is recorded that Alexandra spent much of her time during these final months in quiet needlework alongside her daughters, The women of the family gathered together in companionable silence, their hands occupied with familiar steady tasks, even as the broader uncertainty of their situation pressed increasingly upon them. The bond between Anastasia and Maria, the little pair, whose closeness had defined so much of Anastasia's earlier years, remained a particular source of comfort during these final months, the two sisters continuing to share quiet jokes and whispered conversations that offered brief moments of lightness amid the increasingly somber atmosphere of their confinement. Attendants who remained with the family during this period later recalled the particular tenderness of watching these two sisters together, their heads bent close in quiet conversation, their laughter, though quieter and more restrained than in earlier years, still capable of surfacing unexpectedly, a reminder of the resilient warmth that had always defined their relationship. Alexei's health, always a source of profound concern for the family, grew increasingly fragile during this period, and Anastasia, along with her sisters, devoted considerable attention to caring for her younger brother, whose illness had confined him increasingly to bed during these final weeks. It is recorded that the sisters took turns reading to him, playing quiet games at his bedside, and offering him the same tender, playful affection that had always characterized their relationship, finding in this small act of caregiving a meaningful way to express their love for him, even amid the growing uncertainty surrounding their family's future. Anastasia, in particular, seemed to understand instinctively how to lift her brother's spirits during his most difficult moments, continuing to invent small stories and gentle jokes that could still, even now, draw a smile from him, despite his evident discomfort. Religious faith continued to offer the family a profound source of comfort and strength during these final months, and it is recorded that Anastasia, along with her parents and siblings, maintained their devotion to prayer and religious reflection throughout this difficult period, finding in these familiar rituals a continuity of faith that helped sustain them through the mounting uncertainties of their situation. A priest was permitted to visit on occasion to conduct brief services within the house, and these visits, though rare, offered the family a particularly meaningful source of spiritual comfort, the familiar rhythms of Orthodox liturgy providing a sense of continuity that connected them still to the faith that had structured their entire lives. We might imagine, in these quiet, reflective evenings, the family gathered together in prayer, their voices soft and steady, drawing upon a faith that had guided them since childhood, offering them a sense of peace and acceptance that would sustain them through whatever lay ahead. It is in these moments, perhaps more than any other, that we glimpse the particular quality of grace that seemed to characterize the family's final months together, a quiet, steady faith that allowed them to face profound uncertainty, not with despair, but with a kind of gentle, resigned dignity. It is in these final weeks, too, that we find evidence of the family's remarkable capacity for finding small moments of grace and connection, even amid profoundly difficult circumstances. Anastasia continued to write letters and diary entries, however brief, that reveal a young woman who remained until the very end, deeply engaged with the people and small pleasures that had always brought her joy, her observations touched by an underlying calm and acceptance that speaks to the deep reserves of faith and family love. That had sustained her throughout her short life. She wrote of small domestic satisfactions, a particularly pleasant meal shared together, a quiet joke exchanged with Maria, the simple comfort of her father's steady presence nearby, her attention remaining fixed, as it always had been, on the immediate, tangible textures of family life, rather than the larger uncertainties looming beyond their control. We do not know, of course, the full extent of what she understood or anticipated regarding her family's ultimate fate, and it is perhaps fitting, given the gentle, reflective tone of this telling, that we allow this uncertainty to remain, focusing instead on the evident love and quiet dignity that characterized the family's final weeks together. What we do know, from the fragments preserved in letters and diaries, is that Anastasia remained, until nearly the very end, recognizably herself, her warmth and resilience undimmed by the mounting hardships surrounding her, her capacity for finding small joys and offering comfort to those she loved, remaining steady and constant, even as the circumstances of her life grew increasingly precarious. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the family's long ordeal came to its quiet, sorrowful conclusion. We approach this moment with the utmost gentleness, for it is not our purpose here to dwell upon violence or fear, but rather to honor the family's final hours as a moment of profound togetherness, faith, and quiet dignity. The family was gathered together in the early morning darkness, as they had been gathered so many times before throughout their lives, united in this final moment, as they had been united through every previous hardship and uncertainty. We choose, in this telling, to remember them not through the lens of tragedy, but through the lens of the deep love that had bound them together throughout Anastasia's entire life. A family that had faced immense change and hardship with remarkable grace, and who, in their final moments, remained as they had always been, together, devoted, and quietly at peace with one another. It is fitting, perhaps, that we close this chapter not with dwelling on the details of that final morning, but with a reflection on the extraordinary resilience and love that had defined this family throughout every stage of Anastasia's life. From the golden, sunlit days of her childhood at the Alexander Palace, through the increasing uncertainties of war and revolution, to the quiet, dignified acceptance of their final months together, the Romanov family, and Anastasia in particular, had faced every hardship with a remarkable capacity for love, humor, and grace. Her story, though it ends here in sorrow, is ultimately a story of profound human warmth, of a young woman who, whatever the vast historical forces swirling around her, remained until the very end recognizably herself, playful, loving, and deeply devoted to the family who had been the center of her entire world. We rest now, gently, in this reflection, allowing the sorrow of this moment to settle softly, like evening light, fading slowly into dusk, honoring not the manner of her passing, but the enduring warmth and love that defined the whole of her brief, luminous life. Let us hold on to, instead, the image of a girl running barefoot through sunlit gardens, laughing freely among her sisters, offering comfort to wounded strangers, tending small green shoots in a modest garden, and gathering close again and again within the warm circle of her family's embrace. For it is in these small, tender moments, rather than in the sorrow of her final hours, that the true and lasting spirit of Anastasia Nikolaevna endures. In the years that followed the quiet, sorrowful conclusion of the Romanov family's story, a strange and persistent mystery began to take root in the public imagination, one that would eventually surround Anastasia's name with a peculiar, enduring fascination, unlike that attached to any of her sisters. For unlike the other members of her family, whose fates were, in time, confirmed through careful historical and scientific investigation, Anastasia's story remained, for decades, wrapped in a fog of uncertainty and hope, giving rise to one of the 20th century's most enduring legends. We turn now, gently, to this final chapter of her story, not to dwell on speculation or sensationalism, but to explore, with the same soft, reflective tone that has guided us throughout the strange and moving afterlife her memory came to inhabit in the decades following her death. In the immediate aftermath of the family's death, the Bolshevik authorities responsible for their fate released only fragmentary and often contradictory information regarding what had become of the Romanovs, and this deliberate obscurity, born of political necessity during a time of civil war and revolutionary upheaval, created a vacuum of certainty that would eventually be filled by rumor, speculation, and, in time, genuine belief. Word spread slowly across Europe that the family had perished, yet the precise details remained maddeningly unclear. And this uncertainty, however unintentional in its origins, planted a seed that would grow over the following decades into a rich and complicated mythology surrounding the youngest Grand Duchess in particular. It is worth pausing here to consider why it was Anastasia, among all her siblings, who became the focus of such enduring legend, and the answer lies perhaps in the very qualities that had defined her throughout her short life. She had always been, even as a child, the most vivid and memorable of the sisters, her humor, her mischief, her irrepressible spirit leaving a distinct impression on nearly everyone who encountered her. There was something about her particular vitality that made the idea of her survival feel to a grieving and uncertain world somehow more plausible, more hopeful than the quiet acceptance of her death, as though the sheer force of her personality might have been enough to carry her through even the darkest of circumstances. In this sense, the legend of Anastasia's survival tells us as much about the world's need for hope amid tragedy as it does about the actual historical facts of her fate. The most famous of the many women who would eventually claim to be the lost Grand Duchess emerged in Germany in 1920, a young woman pulled from a canal in Berlin after an apparent suicide attempt, who initially refused to reveal her identity, but who would over time come to be known as Anna Anderson, a name that would become inextricably linked with the Anastasia legend for the better part of the 20th century. Anna Anderson's claim rested on a series of physical similarities to the Grand Duchess, certain scars and marks that seemed to correspond to injuries Anastasia was known to have sustained, along with an intimate knowledge of details regarding the imperial family's private life that seemed, to many who encountered her, difficult to explain unless she truly was who she claimed to be. We approach this part of the story with a particular gentleness, for it is, in many ways, a story about the complicated, often desperate hope of those who had loved the Romanov family and could not bear to accept the finality of their loss. Several relatives and former acquaintances of the imperial family, including some who had known Anastasia personally during her childhood, came forward over the years either to support or to dispute Anna. Anderson's claims and the resulting controversy would consume newspapers, courtrooms, and private conversations across Europe and America for decades, a strange and persistent echo of a story that refused to settle quietly into the past. Anna Anderson's life following her emergence in Berlin took on its own peculiar, almost novelistic quality, marked by periods of institutionalization, extended legal battles over her identity and any potential inheritance, and a peculiar, itinerant existence that eventually brought her to the United States, where she lived for many years, still maintaining her claim to be the lost Grand Duchess until her death in 1984. Books were written about her story. Films were made loosely inspired by the legend she represented, and for much of the 20th century, the question of whether Anastasia had truly survived remained one of history's most captivating open mysteries, discussed and debated with genuine passion by historians, journalists, and ordinary people captivated by the strange romance of a lost princess who might, against all odds, have escaped her family's tragic fate. It is worth reflecting, gently, on why this particular legend captured the world's imagination so powerfully and for so long. There is something deeply human in the desire to believe that even amid the darkest chapters of history, some small light of innocence might have survived untouched, that a young woman once known for her laughter and warmth might have found her way, against impossible odds, to safety and a quiet, ordinary life, far from the tragedy that had claimed the rest of her family. The Anastasia legend, in this sense, functioned less as a historical claim to be proven or disproven than as a kind of collective wish, a story people wanted to believe because it offered a small measure of redemption within an otherwise devastating narrative, a single thread of hope woven into the fabric of an otherwise sorrowful history. Anna Anderson was not, of course, the only woman to claim the identity of the lost Grand Duchess over the years. Numerous other claimants emerged across Europe and beyond, each with their own stories, their own supposed evidence, their own small communities of believers who found in these claims a similar comfort and fascination. Yet, it was Anderson's case that captured the public imagination most powerfully and endured the longest, her story becoming so deeply embedded in popular culture that it eventually inspired numerous films, most notably an animated musical released in the late 20th century that reimagined Anastasia's story as a fairy tale of lost identity and eventual restoration, further cementing her legend in the minds of generations who might otherwise have known little about the actual historical figure behind the myth. The mystery surrounding Anastasia's fate persisted for the better part of 7 decades, until the gradual thawing of political circumstances in Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union finally allowed for a more thorough historical and scientific investigation into what had actually become of the imperial family. In 1991, a shallow grave was discovered near Yekaterinburg, containing the remains of several individuals who were subsequently identified, through careful forensic examination, as members of the Romanov family and their loyal attendants. This discovery marked a profound turning point in the story, offering, for the first time in decades, the possibility of genuine scientific clarity regarding the family's ultimate fate. DNA analysis conducted on these remains, utilizing techniques that had only recently become available to forensic science, confirmed with remarkable precision the identities of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters, though notably, the remains of 2 of the children, initially believed to include Anastasia, were conspicuously absent from this first discovery, a fact that briefly reignited speculation and hope among those who continued to believe in the possibility of her survival. It would not be until 2007 that a second, smaller grave was discovered nearby, containing additional remains that were subsequently identified, through further DNA testing, as belonging to the 2 remaining children, providing at last a complete and scientifically verified account of the family's fate. This final scientific confirmation, arriving so many decades after the initial tragedy, brought with it a particular kind of quiet closure, not only for historians who had long debated the precise details of the family's fate, but for the broader public who had followed the Anastasia legend with such sustained fascination throughout the 20th century. DNA testing, conducted on Anna Anderson's preserved medical samples following her death in 1984, had already, by this point, definitively established that she bore no genetic relation to the Romanov family, revealing her actual identity to be that of a Polish factory worker who had suffered from significant psychological difficulties, a conclusion that, while resolving the historical mystery, could not entirely dispel the emotional resonance the legend had accumulated over so many years of public fascination. It is worth pausing here to reflect with appropriate gentleness on what these scientific discoveries ultimately revealed and what they could not fully address. While DNA evidence conclusively established that Anastasia had, in fact, perished alongside her family in July of 1918, the emotional power of the legend that had grown around her name in the decades following her death spoke to something deeper than mere historical fact, a testament to the enduring human need for stories of hope and survival, even when those stories must eventually yield to the quieter, more sorrowful truths of history. We might understand the persistence of the Anastasia legend not as a failure of historical accuracy, but as a reflection of how deeply her particular warmth and vitality had impressed itself upon the world during her brief life. So much so that even decades after her death, people continued to hope, against all evidence, that some part of that vitality might have survived. In the year 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church took the significant step of canonizing Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children as passion-bearers, a category of sainthood recognizing those who faced suffering and death with Christian humility and faith. This act of canonization offered a particular kind of spiritual resolution to the family's story, framing their final months and their deaths not merely as historical tragedy, but as a testament to endurance, faith, and quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming hardship. For Anastasia specifically, this canonization represents a final, gentle acknowledgement of the qualities that had defined her throughout her life, her resilience, her warmth, her capacity for finding grace even amid the most difficult circumstances, now recognized within the context of her family's shared spiritual legacy. In 1998, prior to this canonization, the remains discovered in 1991 were given a formal burial in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional resting place of Russian emperors, allowing the family to be laid to rest at last with the dignity and ceremony that had been so tragically absent from the circumstances of their actual deaths. This burial, attended by descendants of the Romanov family and dignitaries from around the world, offered a final, formal acknowledgement of the family's historical significance and a quiet, dignified conclusion to the decades of uncertainty that had surrounded their fate. Beyond the realm of historical and scientific investigation, Anastasia's memory has continued to live on through popular culture in ways that speak to her enduring fascination for audiences around the world. Numerous films, books, and works of art have drawn inspiration from her story, ranging from serious historical dramatizations to more fantastical reimaginings that play freely with the legend of her possible survival. The animated film that brought her story to new generations of audiences in the late 20th century, while historically inaccurate in its portrayal of her survival, nonetheless speaks to the particular quality of hope and wonder that her story continues to inspire, transforming a genuine historical tragedy into a kind of modern fairy tale that continues to captivate young audiences unfamiliar with the actual historical details of her life. It is worth reflecting, in these final passages, on what Anastasia's story ultimately offers us, more than a century after her birth, and more than 100 years since her death. Hers is a story that moves through golden childhood innocence, through the gradual encroachment of historical upheaval, through quiet resilience amid mounting hardship, and finally, through a strange and enduring afterlife in legend and memory that speaks to something universal about the human need for hope, even in the face of tragedy. She remains, in the collective imagination, both a specific historical figure, a real young woman who lived, laughed, and ultimately suffered a profound injustice, and a kind of symbol representing lost innocence, resilience, and the enduring power of memory to preserve something meaningful, even from the most sorrowful chapters of history. As we draw this final chapter, and indeed this entire story, gently to its close, let us return once more to the image with which we began, a small, mischievous girl, running barefoot through sunlit palace gardens, her laughter echoing softly through halls that would, in time, fall silent, but which live on now, more than a century later, in the careful preservation of letters, diaries, and photographs that continue to offer us glimpses of her particular warmth and spirit. Anastasia Nikolaevna's life was brief, spanning only 17 years. Yet, within that short span, she left an impression so vivid, so enduring, that her memory continues to captivate and move people around the world more than a century after her death. A testament to the particular power of a life lived with genuine warmth, humor, and love, regardless of how tragically and unjustly that life was ultimately cut short. We leave her now, gently, resting within the quiet dignity of history's final settled truth, yet carrying with us as we close this story the enduring echo of her laughter, her mischief, her deep and abiding love for the family who surrounded her throughout her brief, luminous life. May this reflection on her story offer you, in these quiet hours, a sense of peaceful closure, a gentle reminder of how memory itself can preserve something tender and meaningful, even from history's most sorrowful chapters. And may you now drift softly into rest, carrying with you the quiet, enduring warmth of a young woman whose spirit, whatever the final facts of her fate, continues to touch hearts across more than a century of remembrance.